Thanks, Alex, and welcome everybody back to the 2023 DoD Cloud Exchange. And as we heard earlier at the very beginning of this year's conversation from Lily Zelicki, the Deputy DoD CIO for Information Enterprise, there's really a huge amount of interest among DoD senior leadership in using things like cloud technologies to improve and to rationalize DoD business systems. And luckily, there's already, some precedent for that. And in this session, we're going to talk to two program leaders who've already got a significant amount of experience under their belts running big defense business systems in the cloud. In one case, a big migration. In one case, building a system natively in the cloud from its very inception. So we're going to talk about how they did it and what they learned along the way. Our guests for this segment are going to be Rob Porter, the Acting Product Director for General Fund Enterprise Business Systems, or GFEBS, in the Army Program Executive Office for Enterprise Information Systems, and also Christine Lemaire, the Program Manager for the Naval Applications and Business Services Portfolio in the Navy Program Executive Office for Manpower, Logistics, and Business Solutions. Thank you very much for being here. Really appreciate you both taking the time. And Rob, let me start with you. Talk broadly about GFEBS. We'll get into your journey into the cloud, but give us some sense of what the program's functions and missions are, and some sense of the scale and scope of what y'all do for the Army.
Yeah, thanks, Jared, for having me today to talk about kind of our pathway in the cloud here. In 2020, we were on our way already to move to the cloud as directed by the Army and the DoD, but we took an opportunity and an opportunity with funding to move a little bit more rapidly. So based on some direction and some funding availability, we moved about 7 months sooner. We accelerated the July of 2020, completing our cloud production. My system is the General Fund Enterprise Business System. It is an SAP-based technology, so it's an enterprise resource planning technology, and it accounts for the Army's general fund funding across the year. We account for about $250 billion a year in the Army's general funds.
And tell us a bit about, you said you accelerated your journey to the cloud. What from the start made GFEBS look like an attractive candidate for a cloud migration versus just leaving it in its existing environment?
Yeah, so we were in a pilot already to move to the cloud. And like I said, there was some opportunity with some cloud funds available. But the real big kind of move for us was the technical debt that we had assumed with the system. We were a little bit behind on some cyber activities that we wanted to shore up, as well as some infrastructure activities we had on our on-prem environments. And moving to the cloud allowed us to kind of clear up a lot of that and improve our cyber posture, as well as our ability to kind of update our technical infrastructure to operate, to maximize the operations we had.
Christine, I want to get you in here to introduce folks a bit to your portfolio. You own several systems, including one called Ardeas, which, to the best of my knowledge, was the first DoD system to be built cloud natively. There may be others I don't know about, but tell us a bit about your portfolio and how you think about getting into the cloud with all your systems.
So I think for the Navy, we and specifically my program, we had to rapidly scale to meet dynamic user demand. When they said cloud, we were on board. But also there was a real opportunity there to get contemporary hardware. So the Navy was committed to being that, all in, transforming operations and those business processes to leverage those cloud technologies. Some of the operational advantages that we've seen to warfighting with cloud technologies, vice some of our older legacy client server models are far-reaching, and they include the ability to use micro web services, across the enterprise, and to store authoritative data once and have them reused by many. So it reduces some of that data footprint that is becoming, an issue across, not just the government, but industry. And we could reuse them into different systems for that, data integrity and the context required for speed and accuracy in some of our decision making. Specifically to our days, we migrated due to a Navy mandate. McBoss was the only, platform as a service solution that met that Navy's information impact level. That's our IL, the IL versions, and there's several. There's 4. We actually now have the first AWS ATO for an IL6 environment at the time of our day's inception. So that was the main driver for us in that space.
Rob, similar benefits on the Army side in terms of what Christine talked about. I heard you nod. I saw you nodding when she talked about the niceness of micro web services, et cetera.
Yeah, I mean, I've experienced and had some experience with them before on previous efforts, but with ours, it's slightly different. Being an enterprise kind of system, one of the big things that we've been looking at is optimizing our performance, not just with the cloud with scalability, but with the actual like individual VMs that we've had. So we've upgraded twice since we moved into the cloud in 2020 and optimized both from a performance perspective as well as a cost perspective. So we've used some of those services as well. But being a larger system, we have to kind of lock a lot of things down. So those web services are great, and we've looked at using them, but haven't been as beneficial to us as they have been on the Navy side.
A couple upgrades since 2020. That's a faster pace than I usually expect DoD business systems to be modernized. I mean, say a bit about that. Compare that speed to what you could have done in a traditional on-prem environment.
Yeah, so I mean, our on-prem environment, especially for us within the acquisition community, we would have to plan that out a couple years in advance, make sure that we get the server sizes that we wanted, the types and all the specs that we would have. We moved into the cloud in July of 2020, went through our first year-end close, and year-end close for us being a financial system is a pretty arduous process, and it takes quite a while. It's probably 3 or 4 weeks of effort, big jobs running. Directly after that, we looked at optimizing. We went through kind of a well-architected review with our service provider, and we found out that we could, change our VMs to a different type and optimize our performance. So we did it in the fall of 2020. Recently, we've just gone through that same review, and in the later version, we've been able to kind of get up to that same performance level while actually lowering our cost per use on that. So it's been a great benefit to us as far as keeping those costs down in the cloud.
Christine, say a bit from your perspective on speed of upgrade. And as I understand it, actually, you've actually started to see some experience with incredibly frequent code releases on at least some of your programs.
Some of my programs, but for our days, I will say, because I just had my first all hands last month, we hit our 100th deployment on our days. We are sending out a release every 6.83 days. No small feat in the government. So it is unlike the Army's program. This program is a little smaller, which allows it. I think what we learned from some of the smaller programs that are in my portfolio is it scalable? Can we do that business process reengineering and make it scalable to a larger program, which is what we're working on now within my portfolio, is to bring it to some of those larger programs and make it adaptable.
How much of that frequent code release is attributable to the fact that our days was built with the cloud in mind in the first place? Is it, I got you that size is a factor there too, but that cloud native piece, how much did that help?
I think the cloud native piece helped, but we did have challenges in terms of culture, and getting people in the mindset to see why, going to that cloud native solution was important. Specifically, some of the technical challenges we had were we saw today when I tried to use my NMCI machine to come on to this interview. Bandwidth issues and moving to a cloud was definitely a challenge for us. Today it's not an issue with some services like like AWS Snowball, but schedule issues. He mentioned that earlier. We're a little bit different as we are a defense business system. And so we're currently in my portfolio using the adaptive framework and the swap process to move these software delivery pathways through faster through the acquisition process. But I feel his pain and some of my other programs in terms of how our acquisition process does not meet what we need to do to be adaptive and modernized.
Rob, talk about your pain a little bit more, because one thing that strikes me when Christine mentions bandwidth is your migration definitely started before a lot of the huge bandwidth upgrades that all of the military services and the whole department did as a result of work from home and COVID. How big of a challenge were things like bandwidth, especially in those early days?
Yeah, and so bandwidth was very big because we actually began our process when we started our acceleration about a month before COVID hit, and then we saw that rapid increase. We dealt with a couple of different things, all dealing around the actual migration of the data to the cloud. So, cloud native is a lot easier from not having to move all that data. The first thing we did was we had to work with our partners in DISA and get a dedicated line into the environment. We were the first large ERP within the Army to move to the cloud. There was one other one that was kind of deployed in the cloud at the IL6 level, but that was still ongoing at that time. We needed to work with DISA and get that in there. We also needed to work about access points and get through some of that process with DISA, with NATCOM, and with our partners in the Army. But the other thing that we had to do was we had to figure out a way to compress our data to be able to transmit it in the lowest amount of time. So we talk about July, that our migration went over July 4th weekend, and we took an outage of about 7 days. For a system that's never down for more than about 8 hours at most across a year, 7 days was huge. We had to do a lot for scheduling of our process jobs and making sure that everything got funded appropriately. So we used a tool that was provided to us and compressed our data, got that dedicated line, and was able to kind of cut down the timing of them. We actually got done about half a day ahead of schedule that we had planned. So, once we got to the cloud, we saw a lot of optimizations as far as, uptime and the processing that we had in the cloud versus what we had on-prem just before that.
And beyond just the bandwidth issue, what were some of the other sort of setting the foundation things that you had to think about before you started contemplating moving a system of this size off-prem?
So we also looked at kind of where we were set up from an architecture standpoint. So I talk about we made an upgrade in the fall right after that. We kind of mimicked what we had on-prem, but we had to make some adjustments to it because while we also moved to the cloud, we took an opportunity to upgrade our database technology and move to the SAP S4 component for data. So we made that migration as well, which also helped us again with the data sizing because it compressed it quite a bit and it moved it into a different component where it's kind of coming more out of the memory and the RAM than it is the hard drive of each of the machines at that point.
Christine, moving back to your portfolio of programs, let me take a step back a bit and just ask, what are the considerations that you look at when you're deciding whether one of these systems belongs in the cloud or not, whether it's a good candidate for a cloud migration or whether it, may not be worth the squeeze?
Size, complexity, other considerations, and we're always looking at cost savings. So billing transparency is a struggle and also a consideration that we look at. We look at will it benefit in terms of technology? So if you have a system that's dispersed in several data centers, will putting it in the cloud save cost? If you have for us, it sounds like his systems are a lot larger. Also, do we have an opportunity to modernize the technology? So for example, if we have a system that's sunsetting over 2 to 3 years, it would not be a candidate for cloud, even if there could be cost avoidance. It's just through our acquisition process, what we need to do technically, the acquisition rigor associated, moving the data, all those things come into play, and schedule. I think he just mentioned it. If we can move it quickly, absolutely. But many times our acquisition process does not meet us moving technology quickly. And that's also a consideration.
What are the sorts of things that determine whether you can move quickly or not? You mentioned acquisition being the biggest factor there. What are the acquisition process challenges that you still have despite things like the software acquisition pathway?
Billing. Do we go through a cloud broker? Can we easily access a contract? Does that contract meet our technology? Can we get it through another mean, whether it be GSA, NASA SOUP, some of those other larger enterprise agreements? Can we go to AWS Cloud? Can we go to GovCloud? So there's a whole list of factors in determining how quickly we can access the technology and get there. And then, does the technology that we're currently trying to move the modernized system, does it meet our needs? I'm a combined program office, Navy and Marine Corps. The McSen is very different than on a go-go network than what we have on Navy side, which is government owned, contractor operated, and is the infrastructure support moving it into the cloud. So all those considerations matter when we determine, is this a better prim solution or off-prem solution?
Rob, similar question. In the case of GFEBs, was it more straightforward for you to figure out things like which contract vehicle to use, what acquisition approach to use, or did you have some of the same struggles that Christine just talked about?
Ours was a bit easier because as we were moving, we had the Army had already begun its plans for what its cloud service provider was going to be. They were standing up the Enterprise Cloud Management Agency, the CIO's office, and within the Program Executive Office, Enterprise Information Systems, we had already begun looking at that advertising, and we had our own requirements as far as what we needed. So we had CSP identified as far as where we went to. We initially went to one that was provided to us through our own contract, and then we later on moved to the Enterprise Cloud Management Agency's contract.
And Rob, in this segment, let me come back to you for just a little bit to talk about, as you make a huge decision like moving a system as large as GFEBs to the cloud, how much expertise do you need to build in-house within the program office to determine things like what's the right contract vehicle? Should we do this at all? How do we need to refactor our systems to make this work, period? How much assistance did you get from other government organizations like ECMA, as you mentioned?
Yeah, I mean, with an effort as large as ours, it's a total team effort. Like I talked about earlier about using DISA and working with DISA as far as some of the technical aspects, but from an acquisition side and from a management side, we got help from across of our PEO in the Army, from different aspects, from enterprise services to some of the cloud stuff, and we have a business mission area directorate that was stood up at that time that was helping us as far as cloud selection and helping us with some of the technical aspects of it. We also started working with what was the early instances of the ECMA office within the Army, so the Enterprise Cloud Management Agency that I mentioned before, working with people out in California at the Army Analytics Group, as well as the CIO G6's office, and kind of really getting smart on what we can do with the cloud, and then what we needed to make sure that we had in our contracting language to optimize what we had.
Christine, similar question over to you. I mean, when you think about, again, the decision as to whether a system belongs in the cloud or not, what kind of assistance have you gotten from outside your own office as far as, questions like, is the architecture of this system even cloud tolerant in the first place? Does it make sense to do this or not?
So I'll speak specifically to our days 3.0. It does use a cloud-based infrastructure provided by McBoss, and it focuses primarily on the application layer for capability delivery. Because we were able to use McBoss service model, specifically the basic McBoss infrastructure as a service, and we have an accredited Tanzu CI/CD platform, which is our PaaS offering. The application development team inherits all infrastructure and platform capabilities to include approximately 85% of the risk management framework, cybersecurity controls. How this has benefited us is it allows the application development team to focus 100% of those engineering efforts on mission capability and the user value, which is why I believe we're at that 6.83 days and 100 deployments on our days. Again, we talked about size and scalability. It's smaller. Can we scale it to a larger, EPS, ERP type program as Rob discussed?
What's the answer, you think? Are you trying to figure that out actively right now?
I am actively figuring it out. I'm trying to use this model on a larger system. So we are every day we are innovating and trying to see if some of these smaller successes can turn into big term wins for some of our larger programs within the portfolio.
You've both mentioned cost briefly, and I'd like to dwell on that for just another second here, because it seems like the broader cloud conversation across government has kind of moved pendulum fashion back and forth as to whether you move to the cloud to save money or not. And I'm just wondering how you think about that, Christine. Is cost a major factor that you consider in terms of a go or no-go decision on the cloud?
I think it depends. I'll give you the DAU answer. It absolutely depends. In theory, it should, as cloud should offer the ability to scale and based on payload, as well as offer off service hours. Those cost savings have not been achieved to date. Our bottom line costs went up compared to our data center on-prem hosting, and however, the infrastructure reliability improved. However, in our days, the cloud costs have actually decreased. And in fiscal year 22, they were approximately 455,000, and in fiscal year 23 today paid the bill, and it's 187. So I think we're not there yet to see long term how much cost avoidance we can capture.
Rob, now that you've been in the cloud for a couple of years, have you seen any appreciable reductions in the cost of operating your infrastructure?
We have. The return on investment is probably a different conversation, but the costs are lower in the cloud. I think in fiscal year 21, between our cloud service provider and our managed service provider, kind of if you combine the two costs, it was about 14 million. We've recently taken efforts, kind of taking a FinOps approach to things and looking how to optimize it, kind of in line with what Christine said. Like, the theory is, and everyone would like to talk about all the cloud savings and how it's so much cheaper. I think what we really look at is, can we optimize it, right? Like, the cost may not, move up and down too much, but if we're getting a better service, if we're able to do more, if we're optimizing performance at the same cost that we had previously, to me, that's a big win, and that's a big benefit of being in the cloud. I talked earlier about, the 2 different upgrades we've had to some of our machines. Like, that was something that would have cost us, a pretty good amount of money, and we wouldn't have been able to just execute it rapidly, where we planned and executed that within 6 months, really the last time around where we didn't do that before, and it would have taken 2 years before. So.
And when you talk about optimizing that environment for what the system actually is, can you give us some sense of how big those movements actually are? I mean, we're not talking about moving from one CSP to another necessarily. It's nothing that big, but what kinds of changes are you able to make now?
The optimizations are definitely not moving. They're not days outages. They're kind of flipping the switch on different types of instances and what we're going to pay for in the cloud. So recently we moved some of our VMs, and the majority of them within our database and our storage, to a better volume level that was also a lower cost. So we had optimized like read write abilities within the cloud, and it helped kind of lower our costs as well there. So we've seen that happen.
And kind of getting back to it, I was kind of tongue in cheek on the last question about, have you moved from one CSP to another? And I'm guessing the answer is no so far. But do you look at, do you look at questions like that when you design a system or design a process for moving a system to the cloud, so that you can minimize the possibility that you're locked into a particular contract vehicle or a particular cloud service provider's environment? Does part of this let you be more agile in terms of things as big as, moving to a different target environment one day?
Yeah, CSPs is a tough one, right? Because when you actually have to move the data, that's a whole different conversation. I think as we've looked at our cloud environment and what we've moved to, and we actually have moved vendors a couple different times since we've been in the cloud, but we move them within the same CSP. So we've got a different provider as far as that space in the CSP. We've got different providers as far as our managed services. And what we've done in the Army is kind of design our contracts and our acquisition efforts so that the Army owns the implementation and owns the setup of all that, so that we can easily recompete them and move them and be able to have better competition at those checkpoints where we have the end of contracts and everything.
Christine, how are you thinking about that over on the Navy MLB side in terms of things that you can do to minimize vendor lock or contract lock?
Low code, no code, using common solutions, much like Rob just said, using our own solution. For us, right now, and we do have some of the programs within my portfolio that are all on an IL6 cloud. There's only one pathway to the IL6 cloud. So I'm locked there. We do anticipate others, Black Pearl, and some that are more government hosted solutions. But in the interim, we're locked in for those solutions who need an IL6 environment. And that's where we're at.
Part of the genesis of my question is JWCC is coming someday, even though that, DoD is pretty adamant that nobody's going to be forced to use it. But at some point, it would be nice to move some things to it if it looks like an attractive solution or an attractive target environment for your programs, I would imagine. And so I'm just wondering if such a thing is even possible as a theoretical matter, to move a big DoD business system across a contract boundary like that. Are you thinking about any of that stuff at this stage?
I think that if we can today move Disamill Cloud, Microsoft Azure, Amazon Web Services, we have, Gov Cloud, we have the Appian Gov Cloud, we have all these other solutions. I don't think it's a stretch to think that we won't get there. It's the timing.
Rob, as we start to wind down here, let me come to you with sort of a, what are you doing right now and what's next question. You've had a couple years of experience, as we talked about, working in the cloud. What are some of the big things that you're working on right now? And again, what's next?
Yeah, so we've stabilized, I think, in the cloud over the last couple of years, and we've had pretty good success and performance on there. What we've recently kind of undertaken in the last year or so is to kind of really start exploring and utilizing some of the capabilities at enterprise level that we have within the cloud. This past fall, we worked with our partners down in Orlando at the PEO STRI office, and we completed the first Purple Team assessment for an ERP in the Army. So that's a combination of a red team and a blue team cybersecurity assessment those, kind of like our upgrades for our technology, those are, multiple year plans usually. And we were able to kind of really shorten the window that we had there, get everything done and optimize kind of not only our funding and our availability of how much it cost us, but kind of use the cloud to our own benefit there. I spoke earlier about using the FinOps approach. We're looking at that every time we do a release and an enhancement within our agile framework that we have been operating for the last few years. We're looking at different ways to adjust the infrastructure and kind of optimize our performance so that we can get, the end users what they need as far as the reports and the processing of funding across the Army.
Can you say a bit more about the Purple Team assessments and why that is now unique to GFEBs? Is it just something that is easier to do in a cloud environment? I'm not quite.
Yeah, it's much easier to do in a cloud environment. The Red Team assessment is probably the more impactful one, where you need to have that dedicated environment. We were able to kind of spin up an environment within our cloud instance so that they could do the test there with both the blue team and the red team. So it's a purple team. It is something that, is unique to us right now, but I expect the other ERPs across, not only the Army, but the DoD to probably look to adopt those in the future. So, like I said, typically what we had done before was, 1 year you do a red team, the next year you do a blue team, and you kind of alternate. Us being able to combine them kind of shorten the cost, shorten the planning, shorten everything for not only us in the program office, but the Army in general.
And I hope I'm not going too far out on a limb here by guessing that once you do, or if you do find vulnerabilities through those assessments, they're easier to mitigate in a cloud environment.
Yeah, so it kind of rolls back into what Christina talked about earlier with her software release drops. So everything becomes a lot faster in there. It kind of is variable depending on where you are with the type of technology. So us being an enterprise resource planning tool takes a little bit longer, but we have seen a very kind of big pickup as far as what we're able to remediate. We've done quite a bit on our vulnerability management.
Christine, a similar question to you as we start to wrap up here. What are some of the biggest things you're working on in terms of cloud beyond what we've talked about so far, and what's next for NABS?
So for NABS, I'd like to think Black Pearl may be next, but the timeline is unclear. It's also likely the case that our team will develop capabilities that expand upon some of the limited tool sets that we currently have in our cloud packages. I know specifically for our days, although initially our days, 3.x focused on features and functionality that could be hosted in impact, levels 2, 4, and 5 environments. Our days 3.x shall track use cases and modernize initiatives which may require hosting in an IL6 environment. So I need to keep pressing for Black Pearl so that to your point that we mentioned earlier, that we have that adaptability to go where needed and faster.
All right. I think that is a good place to leave it. I really want to thank our guests, Rob Porter, the Acting Product Director for General Fund Enterprise Business Systems in the Army Program Executive Office for Enterprise Information Systems, and Christine Lemaire, Program Manager for the Naval Applications and Business Services Portfolio in the Navy Program Executive Office for Manpower, Logistics, and Business Solutions. Thanks very much for doing this. I really appreciate you both taking the time.
Yeah, Thank you.
Jared.
And we're going to send it back to the studio. Alex, over to you.